welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. So happy New Year. And, this year we're going to try something new. Instead of our usual opener introducing our guests, my colleague Tim Anaya, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I are going to start with a brief chat about the goings-on in California and the nation, and talk about some of the upcoming books and studies and events happening at PRI. And what we hope is that this will make the podcast a little bit more topical. And then, of course, we will go on with our featured guest. So, Tim, the big news on Friday is that the governor introduced his new budget. So, as many of our listeners know, Tim is in our Sacramento office. He's an 18-year veteran of the legislature. So he's got his finger on the state capital's pulse. So, Tim, what are the highlights of the governor's budget and how is it being received so far?
Well, I watched the governor's budget press conference, so you didn't have to. They've become these marathon affairs, and it actually was about 2 hours long. So consider yourselves all lucky you didn't have to sit through it. But very interesting, the plan the governor has laid out and how they're promoting it. It's, first of all, $164.5 billion in general fund spending, which I think is a record or pretty close to it. It'd be $227 billion when all is said and done, general funds, special funds, and bond funds. And it includes, the governor talked about, we have $34 billion in budget resiliency, which is the budget surplus, the unexpected budget surplus that we had this year. And then also all the various spending and money saved away in the rainy day fund accounts. So there's the main rainy day fund, and there's a few other reserve accounts for specific purposes. A couple of points. One, so the legislature is back in town this week, and the governor is saying that some of his spending proposal can't wait, and he wants the legislature to act in pretty short order to enact his plans for some additional spending to help schools deal with reopening and he has a proposal for a $600 stimulus payments for California to be in addition to anything coming from Washington, D.C. And some business plans to help businesses that are struggling. He wants the legislature to pass that pretty quickly. I think there's a will to move fast from the legislature, but, that's easier said than done. Keep in mind, the governor's budget, is usually the opening salvo in a 6-month-long process to produce the final budget that's enacted in June. So good luck to him if he thinks he's going to get that done so quickly. One thing that was interesting that our Kerry Jackson wrote about in a column on the budget published over the weekend in the Orange County Register was that it includes $1.5 billion in new spending for electric car subsidies and electric car purchases. And Kerry calls it, it's becoming kind of a vanity project for Newsom, like high-speed rail was for former Governor Jerry Brown. And we've seen it's not really going to boost the economy much, if at all, even though he says some of it will be geared toward helping low-income people purchase electric cars. I doubt purchasing electric cars is at the top of the agenda for working families who are struggling to make ends meet. And as our Wayne Weingarten showed time and time again in his work, it is landmark study, Costly Subsidies for the Rich. That's what electric car subsidies end up being, despite what you say about them or despite what the intent. It's the wealthy that have benefited from them to purchase a Tesla or other thing. And on the Tesla front, if the governor noted, Tesla's headquarters have moved out of state to Texas. So if this was a push for more electric car manufacturing in California, it's unlikely that any of this is going to make a big difference. I think the last point I'd note on this is that even though we have, all this budget resiliency now, he projects a structural budget deficit, $7.6 billion next year, going to over $11 billion by 2024-25. So we definitely have some budget uncertainty. Last point that I think is very interesting, he says that we have in place, it's never been triggered, but I think once or twice, is the old GAN spending limit, which requires, if you have propose a certain amount of spending, if you exceed that, you have to basically provide tax rebates for Californians, and the law has been weakened, and it's basically now requires that it be divided between schools and a tax refund. But right now, it's projected that it'll exceed the GAN limit by $102 million. Now, I'm sure we'll find some way to fudge that as the year goes on so that you won't be getting your $1 tax refund anytime soon. But it certainly is a very interesting starting point for the budget debate ahead. And I'll believe it when I see it, when legislators quickly pass some of these things. I think that's a taller lift than one imagines.
So, Tim, I think one issue that a lot of Californians are wondering about, and Californians are suffering because of it, is this mess at the Employment Development Department, or EDD. Will there be any money going to the EDD to shore up the computers and fix the infrastructure there now? Did he talk about that at all in his 2-hour speech?
Well, not surprisingly, the governor didn't say much about it in his press conference, and it continues to be an ongoing scandal. There are still many thousands who are enduring this backlog, and they had hoped to resolve all the cases by the end of the year, meaning 2020 into 2021. One thing that we've seen in recent weeks is that the governor has had a big turnover in his team. There are 2 new people that are going to kind of act as chief of staff. Anaya, who our listeners may know was director of finance and has played a big role in the Schwarzenegger administration and in the Brown administration. She's a smart, savvy person. We're in good hands having her in charge. And then also Jim DeBoo, who'd be more on the political side of things. We know him from he actually, when I worked in the legislature, he ran the Speaker's Office of Majority Services, which was across the hall from the Assembly Republican offices. So these are smart, capable people, and they realize there are messes like this that are lingering that need to be cleaned up. So I would predict that we will have some significant action to resolve all this background, or all these cases, and clean things up. But yes, it's a nightmare for the administration that continues.
Thanks for that, Tim. So we're going to be writing about the budget in more detail on our blog, Right by the Bay, which you can find at pacificresearch.org in the days and weeks to come. So more on the budget in the future. So as far as what's happening at PRI, the week of January 25th is National School Choice Week. And we have a great webinar coming up on January 26th featuring the authors of the book we just released late last year. It's called A Kite in a Hurricane No More. We'll have Mia Giordano, who had a learning disability as a young child and managed to surmount her disability by pursuing alternative education. Now, Mia is headed for college, and clearly, if you listen to our webinar, she wasn't at all well served by the public education system. And of course, we'll have our Lance Azumi, Senior Director of Education Studies, moderating that panel. We also have a new study coming out, Nickel and Dimed in California, coming up. It's by this week's featured guest, USC Professor of Public Policy, Michael Thom. Tim, tell us a little bit about this study.
I thought it was very interesting. We pay a lot of state government fees in California that some of them you may not even realize what they are. For example, if you look at your cell phone bill every month or your regular telephone bill, there are a whole bunch of government enacted fees, state and local government fees on our bill. And what Michael's study goes into is it kind of begs the question, well, what are these fees? What are they going for? Is that money being spent efficiently? And should we continue these fees, or are there better ways to address the problem or fund the various programs or that these fees purport to be funding? So it's very interesting. He goes through really, I thought, on the cell phone especially, and this can be hundreds of dollars over a course of the year that we're paying, and we don't even realize it. So it's a very readable study, quite interesting, and it'll make you think. And Michael has a lot of reform recommendations in there for programs that maybe these should be re-examined. Should we be paying these fees to run sort of outdated and inefficient programs?
Listeners might remember that Michael was in one of our podcasts a year or two ago. He did a study on the use of tax incentives in California for Hollywood. Yep, believe it or not, the government really does give tax incentives to production companies to film in our state, the film capital of the world. But for this podcast, Michael's got an excellent book out now called Taxing Sin. Michael talks about the history of sin taxes. It's not just tobacco and alcohol anymore. We're looking at soda, plastic bags, drugs, marijuana, and other 21st century sins. So thanks to everyone for listening. Happy New Year. And here's Michael Thom. Michael, we're so pleased to have you on to talk about your new book, Taxing Sin, which discusses something quite popular in Sacramento these days, sin taxes. So sin taxes have actually been around for hundreds of years. What were some of the early sin taxes? How were they justified? And how are they different from today's sin taxes?
Yeah, this is a good question. There were a lot of examples of sin taxes throughout history, although in most cases you probably wouldn't have ever heard them called a sin tax. For instance, in Holland in 1574, there was a tax on alcohol, and the purpose was to raise money for military action against Spain. About 30 years after that, England imposed a tax on tobacco because King James didn't like it, and he also had some concerns about what it would do to his constituents' health. In the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire actually taxed coffee, if you can believe it, to raise revenue for some government expenses, especially stipends for a group of Islamic scholars. And a lot of these examples had one thing in common, and that was that they were temporary. When the military conflict was over, when the regimes changed, when the monarchy turned over, the tax went away. Some others were terminated because it was just too hard to collect it. Today, we don't see that anymore. Taxes on tobacco and alcohol are looked at as permanent, sort of as a fact of life that we can't get away from. And if anything, it's spreading to more products.
Yeah, it sounds like these sin taxes weren't imposed to change behavior. For example, cut smoking or cut tobacco use and stuff like that. So it was really for kind of a general purpose or revenue raising for either a war or some community issue. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And in many cases, it was kind of a tax of last resort because throughout most of history, most people didn't work in exchange for a wage. So there was no income tax possible. People weren't very wealthy, so you could forget raising a lot of money through, let's say, an estate tax. And so what did people buy? What could be taxed? Well, some of the same things we buy today. But like I said, it was temporary. The thinking was, look, we have to pay for this war. How can we raise money quickly and spread the burden fairly widely? When the war is over, the tax is over.
I found interesting when you talked about, I was thinking back to my senior seminar in college on the progressive era that I took, Dr. Unger's class. And I thought it was interesting when you were talking about how there was kind of a change in philosophy after the progressive era, thanks to the smashing failure of prohibition. And really, it was the way that sin taxes were devised and marketed underwent kind of a big change in the way they sold them, viewing them now as a win-win for everybody in society. So talk about this marketing shift. If you think about it, every sin tax now is kind of marketed this way. Why did this shift come about, and how is it still successful in sort of enacting and expanding sin tax proposals that are on the table today?
Sure. Prohibition was, as you said, a smashing failure. It was something of a lose-lose. Not only did it not really curb drinking very much, it imposed a lot of unintended consequences, some of which we still have to contend with today. Sin taxes, on the other hand, or the idea of letting people drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes while taxing them, was thought of as the opposite, a win-win. Because it would allow people to make the choices, right? It wouldn't ban anything, so you'd avoid these unintended consequences. So the thinking went. And on the other hand, it would also raise money for government. It would help compensate for the burden the drinkers and the smokers were assumed to impose on everybody else. Now that logic is pretty tight when you think about it, right? And it really has sustained itself over the last couple of decades. The same thinking doesn't just apply to alcohol and tobacco. It's applied in some sense to marijuana. It's applied to soda. It's applied to plastic bags. It's been applied to meat and in certain other foods. We even hear it increasingly applied to things like robots. There are calls for a robot tax, which I discuss in the book. So even though this is something of a relic of the progressive era, it is very much the logic is very much alive and well today.
So, Michael, you write that the drive for sin taxes is really about paternalism, and that, quote, I'm quoting from your book, paternalists embrace taxation as a way to redeem harmful choices. And you suggest that there's a kind of a moralistic thinking behind this push, even though it's being promoted by politicians who aren't really religious or traditionally religious or religious in a spiritual sense, but frankly, they're really just worshiping government and power. Walk us through this thinking.
Sure. There's quite a few parallels between this thinking on the one hand and maybe a religious approach to life on the other. For paternalists and probably for most progressives, they look at government, quote unquote government, as something of a redeemer. And if only government has the right mix of taxes and regulations and bureaucracies, we will embark on some kind of a path toward utopia. We just need the right taxes, regulations, and bureaucracy. It's very similar to certain religious beliefs that put faith in a higher power to perfect humanity through different theological beliefs and even through different rituals. Now, what might some of those rituals be? Well, if you talk to paternalists or a lot of progressives, they say, well, one way to redeem some of your sinful choices, those things that impose harm on society, is to pay for it. Pay a tax on every drink, on every cigarette, on every joint, on every plastic bag, and you will redeem yourself of this harm you have imposed on everybody else. It's very similar to certain religious rituals that say in order to compensate for a mistake you've made, you have to do a good deed. Or even before the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, certain Catholic circles, it was thought that if you purchased something called an indulgence from the Catholic Church, you could redeem some of your sins. So as much as one is a secular approach and one is a more religious approach, there's actually quite a few parallels.
I thought it was very interesting, dovetailing off that point. Having worked in the legislature for nearly 2 decades, you saw a lot of these policies come through, and it really had that kind of paternalistic attitude about it. It really was government trying to dictate how you live your life in so many ways. But also, when you kind of get into what's the justification for these policies, and, I always would wonder, where do these ideas come from? Where do they come up with these wild ideas? And you talk about how the push for these policies like alcohol and soda taxes kind of predicated on data and studies that are inherently flawed. And I love when you say, at the risk of being unduly harsh, and I don't think you need to fear this risk, when garbage goes into an academic study, then garbage inevitably comes out. Kind of what's behind these big sweeping public policy changes being enacted on faulty or at best incomplete studies? And why isn't there more objective or independent analysis? As a taxpayer, I think we would demand that. It makes you wonder, is this a case of where politicians decide on a policy course and then the study just backs that up rather than the other way around?
Yeah, I can answer the second question first. Why isn't there more objective or independent analysis? The answer is pretty simple. There's just no incentive for it. Money tends to follow whatever the so-called consensus is. And if the consensus is that we have to raise the price of alcohol or soda, that's where the research will go. Researchers who parrot that belief will receive funding. Those who are skeptical of it will not. Now, of course, there is good research on all of these sins. I discussed it throughout the book, but I also throughout the book discuss what happens to the people who question some of these orthodox. Their research might not be picked up by the media on the one hand. On the other, whenever you start to question some of these systems, the people who benefit from them mount something of an attack. It could be researchers that are funded by the government. It could be interest groups that are sometimes funded by the government as well, directly or indirectly, who will attack anybody who questions tobacco taxes or marijuana taxes or soda tax. And that has a ripple effect, by the way, because it scares other people off from doing the same types of research. In terms of whether the studies come before the policies or vice versa, it really is both. We have several decades of research on tobacco taxes, for example, and even on alcohol taxes. What they typically do today, of course, is not necessarily support new taxes, but really they're used as justification for increasing existing taxes. There's also something that I think is quite widespread, which is something we call confirmation bias. People in government, even experts, will disregard any evidence that doesn't support what they kind of think going into a question, and they'll only pay attention to the stuff that does, to the research that does. And that has a way of reinforcing the status quo, doesn't it? That's why we still have some of these taxes in the books that aren't temporary, like they used to be, even when research comes up that says there might be some unintended consequences to them.
So, Michael, when sin taxes are imposed, politicians don't think about what economists call the substitution effect, which is what I learned back in the day from my USC professors. In other words, these are trade-offs. So for example, if you don't buy a high-priced soda, you might buy a sugar-filled coffee drink. Or if you don't buy cigarettes in California, you might buy them in an Indian reservation or in a neighboring state or even in the black market. So the taxes end up not exactly achieving the policy objective and may actually make the problem worse. So given this, what explains this paternalistic doubling down on policies that will end up with other behavioral changes that aren't necessarily positive?
It's something baffling to me, especially as I wrote the book and as anybody reads the book, how often this pattern happens, that there is research that questions a tax on soda, on tobacco, on alcohol, on plastic bags, on meat, on robots. And despite this evidence, the paternalists, the progressives, typically double down. And all I can think of is that it comes down to psychology. Many of these folks are too invested or too tied to the notion that government is the redeemer, that it is the savior of humanity. And they do not easily give up that philosophy. They don't abandon it, even in light of evidence to the contrary, which is sometimes a criticism levied at people of religious faith. What happens instead is they typically point the fingers at everybody else. They will say that the problem wasn't the tax, it was that you didn't pay enough of the tax. So alcohol taxes should be higher, tobacco taxes should be higher, soda taxes should be higher. When they need to, they will also, of course, conduct research that conveniently enough supports that perspective. Throughout the book, as you noted, they don't necessarily do objective research. They don't even necessarily do research based on real world data. They run simulations that they can control what goes in, and they can, once again, very conveniently control what comes out. And so all of their research ends up confirming what they already thought. And it's very hard to break that cycle. Fundamentally, though, it's psychology.
I was struck, following up on the point you made a minute ago about, some of the proceeds from these taxes going to fund this questionable research. I was struck reading in your chapter on alcohol taxes, proceeds from alcohol taxes are actually allocated by government as grants to interest groups that are promoting policies like increasing alcohol taxes. So can you talk about this and also share some of the reforms and alternative policies that you outline in the book that might address our nation's alcohol problem more effectively?
Sure. This was a big surprise for me. I never fully, followed the money on where some of this revenue went. But when I did, I saw, once again, a pattern that whether it's alcohol or some of the other sins, very often some of the money ends up trickling back to the very same groups that lobbied for the tax in the first place, which I tend to think is something of a conflict of interest. Many of the anti-alcohol groups, though, as you noted, and even anti-alcohol researchers depend on government grants. Now, sometimes it's funded directly by a tax. Sometimes it's indirect. It's just paid out of general government revenue, but sometimes that's where the alcohol tax money goes as well. Other interest groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving have lobbied local officials to mandate victim impact panels for drunk drivers. And of course, Mothers Against Drunk Driving charges for those panels. And the evidence tells us that they don't really work. In fact, they might make the situation worse. That's tragic enough. It's also tragic that we know what does work. If you wanted to reduce drunk driving, for example, we have a pretty good idea of what works. You have to number one, above all else, make sure people who drive drunk pay the consequences for doing so. It's not fair and it's not efficient to make everybody else pay a higher price for alcohol because a small number are going to abuse alcohol. We don't apply that logic to matches because they might be used to start a fire, and we don't apply it to knives because they might be used to commit harm. Alcohol really shouldn't be any different. What does work? We have pretty good research that sobriety checkpoints work. This is a way of catching people who are impaired while they're on the roads before they go on a highway, for example. We also know that it makes a lot of sense to have a robust civil justice system where people who are hurt by a drunk driver, either they're injured or they're family members of people who were killed or their property is damaged, they have to have the ability to file a lawsuit against the person who committed that harm against them. There's also a lot to be said for actually enforcing laws that are already on the book. Governments, whether it's state or local or both really, they have to put money into enforcing drunk driving laws that are already there, and for making sure people who were caught and found guilty are actually sanctioned and not just given a slap on the wrist. Do those things, drunk driving will come down. It will not go away. You will never be able to eliminate all of it, but you can certainly do much to reduce the harm again, without spreading the pain to people who use alcohol responsibly by charging them a higher price.
So let's move on to tobacco taxes. As you know, there's a big movement across the country trying to ban vaping and flavored vaping products. These are, alternatives that, while they're not necessarily healthy, they're certainly less dangerous than smoking or chewing tobacco. And they've actually proven to reduce the number of smokers. And talk about this in your book and, again, why this paradox?
Yeah, this is what almost seems to be a constant conflict within public health circles. It's called harm reduction, and it's a question of philosophy. Does the government ban something like tobacco or even certain other drugs or even sex work, or do they allow people to engage in those behaviors but try to find ways to reduce the harm that exists? Vaping is just the most recent and probably at present anyway, one of the most current iterations of that debate. So the question is, do you ban vaping or tax it very heavily and make it difficult for people to do, or do you kind of take a hands-off approach? And I think in some governments, they've very quickly said, we don't want any electronic cigarettes or any kind of vaping products to be sold. Unfortunately, that's going to just push people toward the more harmful alternative, which would be tobacco products. So some of these experts and some policymakers will probably have to give a little and say, if given a choice between vaping or smoking a cigarette, it probably makes much more sense for people to vape, not to smoke cigarettes. So the last thing you should do is make vaping harder to do. Don't ban it and don't make it more expensive. When you do, you just push people back to cigarettes.
I think one thing that these proponents are concerned about is children smoking or using these products. And we've always argued at PRI that we ought to enforce these, the children shouldn't be smoking under 18 and business owners shouldn't be allowed to sell these products to children. What do you think about that? Again, it's back to this kind of enforcement issue that you talked about in your earlier question.
Certainly, it makes sense when minors are involved, when children are involved, to treat them like children and minors, but to not treat adults the same way. I think it makes a lot of sense across the board to make sure that you could draw the line anywhere. Is it 18? Is it 21? Is it 16? I don't know. It probably depends. But that there should be limits on what you can consume, not just when it comes to tobacco products, but when it comes to alcohol as well, when it comes to marijuana. But once you are an adult, I think is good policy to let adults make adult choices and not try to intervene in them, because the cost of doing so is often greater than the benefit. The other risk, of course, you bring up kids, is that when you ban something for everybody or you make it harder to do it, it kind of makes it more appealing to those who would like to rebel against authority, which is typically teenagers. So governments have to be careful in what they try to ban or what they try to criticize, because it will always trigger something in parts of the population that makes them want to do it even more.
So in reading your chapter on marijuana, I was struck, and this is something that I saw time and time again in the legislature. You write in your opening chapter that policymakers will condemn a choice on one hand, but then on the other hand, they'll vote for budgets that require millions of individuals to continue to make that very choice. And isn't that really what all of these sin taxes are about? It's imposing huge taxes on Californians who patronize illegal industry to generate more tax revenue and fund questionable programs in perpetuity.
Well, I think that's fair. And for proof, one doesn't have to look any further than some of the interest groups I discuss in the book that have calculators on their websites, calculators that are supposed to estimate the benefits that come from taxing soda or taxing alcohol. What's interesting about multiple calculators that I identify in the book is that they don't actually calculate any kind of public health impact. All they do is estimate how much extra money the government will raise. And one of them actually estimates how many government employees could be hired if only we raised a tax on this sin or that sin. So if you look at that objectively, I think, it's not so crazy to say, what's the real motive here? Is it to actually improve public health, or is this just another tool to raise money and expand government bureaucracies, expand the reach of government into people's lives? I would argue that that's what it is. It may have some public health motivations, but it is certainly not only public health motivated. This is about raising taxes.
So for our last question, we always seem to be able to work out a COVID-19 question in practically all of our guests. So in our discussion here about individual choice versus relying on the science, which is an argument used by a lot of proponents of sin taxes, it sort of reminds us of this debate we're having now on lockdowns during the pandemic. So in your opinion, is the push for more government mandates and powers the next sin tax movement, what you call in your book, quote, stalking horse for a progressive movement that never really ended?
It certainly could be, although I think it's a little too early to see which way this will go. If you had asked me this in April, I might have a different answer than I do now, because there has been much more pushback against some of these policies from public health experts, many of whom also say we should tax our sins, that I didn't see coming a couple of months ago. So whether it's lockdowns, whether it's shutting down certain businesses, but not shutting down others, I think there's much more public skepticism about some of these COVID-19 policies than there are about, say, taxing tobacco product. And so that tells me that this may go a little bit of a different way. The other difference I see is that many of the skeptics of some of the COVID policies are taking this to the courts and they're winning. And we've seen policy change as a result. The other big difference, and it's certainly been in the news the last couple of weeks, is that some of these policies have very much been undermined often by progressive politicians that tell the masses to do X while they do Y. That seems hypocritical, and it certainly is, but it's kind of consistent with what I discuss in the book, which is this kind of paternalistic philosophy where if you're in government, you kind of think you know better than everybody else. You and I are looked at as dumb, ignorant, and unable to make good choices, while the people in government do know how to make better choices and make it for us. And so that's how you end up with, stunning cases where we can't go out to eat, but certain politicians can. And people recognize that across the political spectrum as something that rubs them the wrong way. If enough people continue to be rubbed the wrong way by these policies, I don't think it'll become permanent.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. And got a terrific book out. Tim and I bought it. We got it on Barnes & Noble. Is it now available on Amazon? I think through Kindle. Is that right?
Kindle only on Amazon.com. I'm more than happy for people to buy it from Barnes & Noble. I figure Amazon gets enough of our money as it is.
Well, anyway, it's a wonderful and fresh take on sin taxes. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends to subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now iHeartRadio and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these platforms, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for joining us. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.